Welcome back to the Power Market Podcast. I'm Ryan McMagan, Editor-in-Chief at the Mises Institute. And if you haven't visited our site lately, be sure and check it out. It's mises.org for a lot of commentary on issues like Austrian economics, freedom, peace, international relations. And we'll be covering some of those topics lightly today. Certainly a lot of what you'll encounter on the site are deeper takes, more academic sort of content. Now, we've also got events coming up where some of our fellows, senior fellows, some of our student speakers, even in some cases, will be there. But Tho Bishop is joining me today, as well as Connor O'Keefe, two of our contributing editors. And Tho, I bet you can tell us a little bit about some of our upcoming events.
Well, our first event for a jam-packed 2026 schedule is in Oklahoma City. I don't think I've ever been there, but we're going to change that in February 21st for an event dedicated to entrepreneurship beyond politics. If you're looking to get a break of all the political headlines, then we've got actual real people doing real big things. I'm including Dr. Heath Smith of the Oklahoma Surgery Center and the Free Market Medical Association, and one of my personal favorites, Caitlin Long of Custodia Bank, who's been doing big things in the crypto space. We'll also have our own Ryan McMakin. We'll have Per Byland, of course, because he lives in the area, and Timothy Terrell, who's working on a book project that we're excited to be seeing in the future. So you can find out more about that and all of our events coming up in 2026, or at least those that have been listed yet. There's even more to come. So keep that book page fresh. You can find all that at mises.org/events. And also, since I know we get a lot of students listening, if you are a grad student in particular, and you want to have a one-of-a-kind experience, you want to follow the legacy of people like Patrick Newman and Jonathan Newman, Per Byland himself, many others. The Mises Institute Summer Fellowship, it's a research fellowship. It's a fellowship in residence. The deadline for that is coming up next month at the start of February. If you've got a research proposal, submit it. You have access to all of our archives, access to our scholars like Dr. Joe Salerno, like Mark Thornton, like Jonathan Newman. A great option. And best of all, you get to stay at Rothbard Village. You get to enter a special fraternity of Rothbard Village alums. That and many more perks that come with it. Spend your summer in Auburn if you're a grad student. You can learn more about that at mises.org/research fellowship. I truly recommend anybody who is a grad student to apply. It's an incredible experience. Always one of the highlights of my time at the Institute, so definitely check that out.
Well, going on right now is basically what you might call the anti-Mises Institute. This is the Davos event.
They got Keynes Village up there.
Do they real? I don't even know if you're kidding or not. Okay.
Hopefully they don't have a lot of Keynesian activity, but there.
Surely. And this is where all the,
the
corporate welfare, recipients, they all get together and they plot some new evil for the world. These are, of course, the people who pioneered the idea of how you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This is their vision for the future. And they just love to hatch up new ideas to push around the little people who they, of course, despise. So let's talk about Davos a little bit, Connor. Connor, what's your take? I mean, usually there's some highlights. Usually there's something going on there that seems especially awful. Have you seen anything like that this year?
Well, the big thing for sure has been the Greenland drama that sort of has defined at least the first few days. And I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole. I don't know if you guys want to get into that now or do more of a general overview. There were some other things too, but that's kind of been the big thing at the middle. I mean, just real quick, I'd say the other two things that are kind of related. One, Mark Carney, I think is how you say it, the Prime Minister of Canada, gave a interesting speech that could be worth getting into a bit. And then there's also Trump's Board of Peace, which was happening earlier today, which is also kind of an interesting kind of reality TV moment when we're talking about global politics. Those are the big three things, kind of dynamics happening right here. But I don't know. Do you guys want to dive into Greenland first?
Well, let's talk about the dynamic, which of course is related to the Greenland thing, but it's going to continue far beyond the Greenland thing, which is this issue of is the rest of the world just going to continue to accept the United States as the undisputed leader of everything? And Carney's speech certainly went against that. Now, Americans, they get really upset when other countries act like America isn't the best country, which is kind of weird, right? Americans always talk about how, of course, you should love your country, America, love it or leave it. And then if foreigners who are citizens of other countries express any disliking of America, they get really upset for people loving their own country, or maybe not liking when foreign countries intervene in their country, which just shows a certain short-sightedness. But that's essentially what Carney was doing, is saying that maybe this whole rules-based world order is coming to an end, which displays, I think, a certain level of naivete in the sense that, I mean, we were saying back in 2022 that the rules-based world order was always nonsense, in the sense that, right, it only applied to countries not the United States, or countries the United States didn't like. So it obviously doesn't apply to Saudi Arabia, it doesn't apply to Israel. There's no rules that apply to those countries. No rules that apply to the U.S. The U.S. invades whatever country it wants, but they invoke the idea of a rules-based international order so that we can say, oh, Russia violated the rules-based international order because, well, that's a country we don't like, so therefore they have to follow the rules. But we Americans, we don't have to follow the rules. All that said, Carney is saying is that this order, this post-World War II order that the U.S. so clearly dominates in, is coming to a close, or at least on the decline. A lot of Americans get really worked up at that. But I think just the first thing I would say, and then I'll throw it to you guys, is the people who think that saying this sort of thing is ridiculous seem to have this bias to believe that whatever's going on right now will continue indefinitely into the future forever. So the fact that the United States currently exercises near hegemonic power right now, but is clearly declining in terms of relative power, because what you have are rising, especially Chinese power. Russia, it continues to deleverage from the overall global order and establishing itself into a larger Eurasian sort of economic and political bloc with the Chinese and with other nearby countries. And then there's BRICS, which is very weak at the moment, but the assumption always seems to be, well, America's on top right now, so it will be forever. What these other countries are trying to do is, you could ask John Mearsheimer about it. He could explain to you in detail. They're trying to balance against the United States. So there are two things that other countries do when there's a big, important country in any international system. You could be a regional hegemon. You could be a global hegemon. The U.S. has always aspired to be a global hegemon. It missed that boat. It had a brief period where it almost had it after the collapse of the Soviet Union and was not able to achieve it. And now clearly that's not going to happen because of the presence of China, especially. It's not going to achieve global hegemony. That the fact that the U.S. is a regional hegemon, obviously the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. This is undisputed, and that's not going to change for a long time. However, during most of that period, the U.S. maintained friendly relations with pretty much all of these Western countries, Eastern Europe as well, a number of Middle Eastern countries even, and certainly in Latin America also. And so what you had was heavy amount of what was called bandwagoning. So that was countries saw a clear benefit to going to the U.S. side, to rallying to the U.S. side, being friends and allies with the U.S. side. The U.S. regime, not just Trump, but the U.S. regime has been so aggressive in terms of setting up sanctions against who knows how many countries now, sending drones to bomb various countries, siding with Israel on everything, that trying to be friends with the United States has not nearly as clear a payoff anymore, because you could spend decades trying to be a close ally with the United States, i.e. Denmark, and then the U.S. turns around and treats you like garbage. So what's the advantage of being a friend of the United States? You could have the rug pulled on you at any time. There's clearly some advantages to it still, but it's not nearly as clear as it has been historically. So now a lot of countries are looking at balancing against the United States. So instead of joining the bandwagon with the U.S., they now think if enough countries get together to balance against the United States, we can start to diminish the U.S.'s relative power in the international system. And that's what I think that's the right way of looking at Carney's speech. is this is a rallying cry for more balancing against the United States, and they're turning away from bandwagoning. And this takes years to play out. And so the fact that you got all these Trump lovers are like, oh, ha, ha, the U.S. is clearly so ascendant compared to all these other countries. Yeah, in 2026, I have no doubt. But what happens in 2026 isn't what's going to be happening in 2035 or 2030. The world changes. Things change, gang.
History doesn't end, Ryan? Is that what you're saying?
Right. I mean, it's amazing that things aren't frozen in time forever, but that seems to be what a lot of Americans are counting on. But there clearly seems to be some movement there. And I think Davos, what's happening at Davos, I mean, the Greenland issue is part of that, but it's just, I think, a one piece of what's going on. And I think we're probably going to see more of that. I don't know. I mean, if you want to get into specifics of Carney's speech, I think just the big thing was him just basically saying, hey, America isn't everything, guys. But what do you think?
Well, I think the notable thing from my perspective is that he laid out what you said earlier, that the rules-based international order is a fiction. Like, there has been some rhetoric, I think especially since Ukraine started with this kind of like rebalancing framework, the European Union and European countries kind of wanting to sort of pivot away from just sort of blindly following the U.S., but he called it a lie at the beginning. He said that it was a useful lie, which, it was for people for countries that were close to the U.S. They very much benefited from this, but it was like, I mean, to me, it was like a calling the emperor out for having no clothes moment, but instead of a kid, it was like a minister of the emperor. Like, it's kind of somebody that's supposed to be very bought into this whole thing and keeping this fiction alive, saying outright on like the world stage that it's just a lie and we're doing it because it's been useful for us, but we may pivot away if that changes, is very interesting and something that you don't just walk back. I think that's kind of the dynamic that's going to be very interesting to watch going forward. Is like, and we talk about this a lot in our circles, like the ideas in people's heads are so important for like how power actually resides in society and on an international scale as well. And so, like, yes, I agree. Like, we're on this trajectory of the U.S. kind of losing its post-Soviet, post-Cold War status. But what's been interesting over the last few decades is Europe has been behind the U.S. for a lot of what it's doing. Obviously, Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think it's very interesting to think about what U.S. foreign policy and international relations more broadly would look like if Europe was not behind Washington as steadfastly as it has been. And yes, that like it's not like this was a sudden pivot to that reality, but this was, in my opinion, a pretty major step, just because he's calling out this whole thing as being this collective lie that they're all kind of working together to keep intact, is, this big source of their power, to kind of admit that to everybody. And also, I mean, just the fact that Carney is not like some like wacky kind of populist leader. Like he's Justin Trudeau's or in Justin Trudeau's party, like his next in line. And it's just, to me, very interesting to hear somebody calling out that specific part of all this, the fact that it's all a lie that is, like he said, useful. Like it's just like, this is what we're chirping about all the time, and to see them just admit it on stage is pretty remarkable.
Well, it's a good reminder too, because obviously people at Carney's level, they know it was always a lie, right? What was interesting is that they helped maintain the lie, as you're saying, right? They repeated this pro-U.S. propaganda because it served their purpose. And so their job, in part, was to convince the Canadian man on the street that they were part of this international order that they benefited from with the U.S. in charge. Carney knew that wasn't true. And everyone at that level knew that wasn't true, just like everyone in Washington knows that's not true, that it's a lie, except for some tiny percentage of true believers, like Ted Cruz maybe. Seems like he's just dumb enough to believe that stuff. But for the most part, what was remarkable was how the elite, the foreign policy elite from around the world, was pushing the lie to help America. And they've abandoned that position. So yeah, that is an important distinction that you make, is that we're talking about non-Americans who knew the reality, but repeated the fake version of reality anyway. And yeah, it's nice to see some recognition of what a joke it always was, and things are different now.
Well, it's a fascinating speech. The only speech of this type that I can think of off the top of my head from a Western leader calling out, America and the assumed status quo and that has always been sold was a 2019 speech by the governor of the Bank of England, who was raising concerns about, at the time, the demand of the dollar globally, how the dollar as a global reserve currency, we've all accepted it for so long. It has the risk of being abused. We need to think about something different than that. And really, again, putting a spotlight on one of the very assumed sort of norms of the global political status quo. And the Bank of England governor at the time was, of course, Mark Carney. And so I think those two speeches actually complement each other extremely well. Now, to this broader point, though, when we think about this rising multipolar world, or call it what you will, I do think obviously America has lost an element of global dominance relative, I think, particularly to China. Right, I think it's easy to overstate Russia. I mean, obviously, it's a belligerent. It's been very aggressive on its own borders. But I mean, I think it's very easy to overstate Russia's global influence at this time. But obviously, China is making very real advances in tech and other sort of areas, even cultural advances here and there. But the area, the global power that has lost the most over this time is, of course, Europe. And to me, I think Carney is responding, even though Canada's not Europe, but I mean, it basically should be. My big takeaway of the Davos narrative is just how small Europe looks. And of course, this is all self-inflicted, right? I mean, Europe has, destroyed its own economy. Europe has given its sovereignty to the EU in many such cases. Europe has been the biggest loser of the last several decades, all from, machinations of their own governments doing. And to me, Zelensky is usually, not someone I praise to a great extent, but he had comments along these lines. Obviously, he's got his own self, motivation there, and he wants to, Europe to be big and bold like Trump and to, give him more weapons and that sort of stuff. But his big message to Davos was about how weak Europe looks right now. And to me, that's my biggest meta takeaway. And obviously, the Greenland stuff plays into it. All the, but to me, it's how small Europe looks on the global map right now is, to me, the narrative from Davos that I think is most important. And I think Carney is himself trying to position himself a bit as a leader of that, trying to, and he pointed to, look how the culture we're developing in Canada and how polycentric it is and how accepting we are, and this is the model for the rest of the world. Of course, I mean, look at Canada. That's not exactly what I would want, right? In many ways. I'm not, particularly excited about, wanting, I don't know how many European countries are biting the bit at government subsidized euthanasia anytime soon. But I think Carney is trying to position himself, and to a certain extent, you look at other European leaders. I mean, Carney is, and I think in many ways a lot more serious, in ways we don't like, right? But he seems to me as being one of the more serious leaders out there. Macron tried to take the stage and do his little bit. I mean, obviously his domestic issues are what they are in recent elections from their perspective. But I think it's very interesting Carney trying to present himself as the sort of anti-American leader of the West, if you will. And I think his speech went a long way to position himself in that role.
Yeah, importantly, Carney is not a populist, as you stated, and he's an international banker. He has direct access to the world of geopolitical minded finance. So to treat this guy like, he's just a kook from the hinterland of Canada, the exact opposite is true.
Probably the only leader of Davos that took a step downwards in terms of political power from his previous position. I don't know. Would you rather be a central bank, a central banker, or would you rather be a political leader? I think many would much prefer to be in the position of a central banker. But
yeah, the Anglosphere is an odd place. I'm the governor of the Bank of England 1 minute, and then I'm the Prime Minister of Canada the next. I mean, I guess that's seamless in the year 1910 or something, but it seems like there would be more problem with that. But I guess Canadians don't care that your president is a foreign banker.
He probably had to learn some foreign languages being in Canada now, and not just it's Chinese and a few others. But that's a whole nother demographics issue for Canada.
I mean, I've been reading Vilfredo Pareto stuff lately. Just motivated somewhat by Ralph Raico on this, who clearly was something of a fan. And boy, this got to be like a case study in elite theory, right? Mark Carney and how that works, and the circulation of elites in and out of countries, in and out of central banks, really quite amazing. And you act like there's some sort of real turnover in who's running Canada, but of course there's none whatsoever. We start to realize who's really running the place. And then of course we realize who's really running things every time we look at Davos. And we can see how they get together, and they, well, of course, I assume this year, like every year, that the town was flooded with sex workers. That the price of a prostitute went up 10,000% or whatever. The same thing happens when there's ever like a political convention in town.
A lot of Keynesians.
They're people with high time preference, to say the least, and yet somehow have managed to acquire zillions of dollars. But that's what we're dealing with right now, and. So clearly they're getting together, and this is a topic of conversation. The question is, though, I mean, does this set the stage for any future presidents, U.S. presidents, or well, I guess I want to put it this way. Clearly, like, the larger macro geopolitical trends are beyond anything that a U.S. president can just simply change with a snap of the fingers. However, are these guys just like biding their time until Trump's out of office, and then be like, okay, now we can get back to friendly relations with the United States again? Or do they think this could maybe be something that will continue? I actually have no idea if anyone's giving any thought to what things are going to look like in the year 2028 or 2029 rather.
Yeah, that's sort of been one of my takes, is that for all Trump's bluster and everything he's kind of doing on the world stage, it doesn't feel like anything that he's done anything that won't easily be reversed by another president coming in, whether it's this term or maybe Vance is in for a term. And so that's kind of been my take, is that it's sort of what we've been talking about with the Fed, that they just sort of want to weather the storm, and then they can kind of treat all this as a diversion from the norm in some kind of weird couple of years. But Carney's speech kind of made me rethink that, because this was a little bit of a Rubicon crossing, like we were just talking about. Saying that this is all basically useful fiction is something that you're not able to just walk back from. And so I similar to you, I'm not really sure too much what to think about this, because I mean, that was just, I guess, kind of a shocking thing there, and it does lend credence to the idea that they view this as a real trajectory that they're not just going to be able to correct back from once Trump is off the stage.
I mean, I do think it might be shrewd on Carney's part, because like there is this underlying question of, let's assume, right, that 2028, again, obviously, the midterms are not looking pretty good for Republicans, but let's say JD Vance became president. JD Vance seems to be far more anti-Europe than Trump is, right? I mean, Europe can kind of schmooze Trump here and there. Right, he'll bluster a lot, but I don't think he has any sort of sincere, diehard ideological disagreements with Europe. I think Vance has been a lot more pointed on specific criticisms of the way the EU governs itself, the way that it treats it treats American companies. Right, I think that Vance is far more anti-European, far more anti-EU than Trump is. And maybe that can kind of continues the trend there and whatever. On the Democrat side, though, is that like if you assume that Trump's a blip, and you have, someone firmly within the, Hillary, Biden, Kamala mold going forward, right? And then maybe that's a return to, the international rules-based order being run from DC. But there's also, I think, a very, kind of sound viewpoint that the Democratic Party is also changing. That the future of the Democratic Party is going to be less Hillary and it's going to be more AOC, right? And obviously AOC is not JD Vance, not Trump in many foreign policy ways, and I'm not trying to suggest that she is some sort of serious threat to the status quo by any means there, but it is a different. I think there is some real differences in terms of I think it is a separation from Obama Hillary style Democratic Party. So there might be some wisdom in recognizing there's a broader political realignment going on, shifting of ways than what you were used to from the 90s. It's also going to be interesting to see whether any of this really matters. Like, does Europe? It seems to me that Europe is very hostile, and I see no real ideological shift to reversing any of the policies that has made it weak, right? We're not seeing a massive rush to reverse, its nuclear policy, right? You have German politicians bemoaning the fact they shut down their nuclear power plants, but we're not seeing a renuclearization on the power side of things and a complete elimination of green political parties' influence on policy. Like we're not seeing, okay, we got to get serious about our tax problems here because we've choked the life out of our big businesses. It seems that to any certain extent, and Canada plays a role within this and some of their recent deals, is that ultimately, if Europe is unable, because of its own ingrained political positioning of its leaders, lack of political will, whatever, that it's simply taking less reliance from Washington and more reliance from China. And so if that is the case, then, okay, that does have massive geopolitical ramifications. But is that going to make Europe a more robust global power and a more polycentric global order? No, you're just kind of training one master for another in that regard. Maybe they're going to split custody, right? But I think Europe is unable to really address the underlying issues that has made it so weak. And so Carney can go up there and bluster, but ultimately Canada is not becoming more self-reliant. They're just becoming more reliant upon China.
Yeah, and we should note that the EU has been bad for overall global trade in Europe in the sense that it has become more restricted because it's not like you as a member country can just go out and trade with whoever you want. And this was one of the complaints that you got from the UK in terms of why they wanted out of the EU, is that it constrained their trade policy so much, was that if you wanted to trade externally, of course it's good for trade in terms of other members of the EU, and that's what it was founded for, as basically a customs union. Great. But in terms of trading with the rest of the world, it adds layers of bureaucracy.
And to that,
well, go ahead.
Didn't mean to cut you off, but drawing back to this parallel of the Bank of England Carney versus Canada Carney and the Davos model now, is that at the time of Carney's speech in 2019, he was using it as stating the need for central bank digital currencies and basically calling for Europe and England to further control its currency and to as a way of creating more independence away from the dollar. What we've actually seen, though, is that the European banking system, yes, they're trying to do central bank digital currency, but that's actually creating more demand for U.S. stablecoins as something that's independent from that. And so, in many ways, I think there's a lot of a very shrewd analysis that on the monetary side of things, the influence of the Fed and of the dollar, regardless of our own individual opinion of it, is actually more favorable in Europe now, is actually becoming a bigger role now because consumers have that choice than it did in 2019. And so again, given, if Europeans have the ability, this is why Europe has to almost embrace a more tyrannical model, because failure to remove these underlying interventions in their economy, the businesses and European, if they have alternatives, they will seek other alternatives. I mean, one of the criticisms of Macron, for example, was saying like, oh, we don't need more cheap stuff from Canada, from China that doesn't fit our standards. We need more direct investment from China. And so again, this is consistent resistance of they want to continue their control over the market in ways that it has its own consequences. You can't just politically will yourself into being a global power if you are fundamentally altering and damaging your economy and your society with the interventions that has made Europe where it is right now.
Yeah, Europe is not a free marketplace. Freedom is not their thing. You can just see this in how they treat freedom of speech, online speech, that sort of thing. They have nowhere near the relationship with the idea of natural property rights that American libertarian types have, right? It's certainly free markets more or less can be good on a pragmatic level, but they can always be constrained by legislation, and rightly so in their mind. And what that means then is that there is nothing considered to be free from some sort of regulation, some sort of control, some sort of subsidy. I mean, just look at the French markets. The agricultural market is so hidebound. It is so caught up in such endless subsidies and controls. Trade is this insanely complex thing. This is not a functioning economy if we're looking at it in terms of providing some level of market freedom, right? We're not even talking pure laissez-faire. We're just talking the sort of system where the posture is just generally in favor of markets rather than state control. I don't think that phrase could be used to describe most European regimes at this point. Nonetheless, these are very powerful countries. And so what we note, though, is that their weakness is a choice. And you said, though, it's self-inflicted, right? You take any of the larger countries in Europe, take two of them, and you have larger GDP than Russia. So this idea that Europe is at the mercy of Russia without the United States is simply untrue if Russia wished it not, or if Europe wished it not to be so, right? It would not be anywhere near a difficult task for France to up its nuclear arsenal a bit. And to join forces with Germany to develop better defense capability for the continent. They absolutely do not need the United States to do that, but they're so obsessed with just augmenting their welfare state, for bleeding the American taxpayer dry. That's just been their status quo for decades. That's what they're sticking with. But that's a choice they make. There is not something structural in Europe or its institutions that makes it incapable of dealing with Russia, which is one of the poorest countries in Europe in terms of GDP per capita. This is not a rich country. They just look good compared to countries like Ukraine and maybe Bulgaria and some of those poorer countries in Eastern Europe, but they're not even in the same league as a country like Germany. And even with Germany being much smaller geographically, all Germany just has to team them up with one or two other large European countries, and they could easily overwhelm the Russians in terms of, because all they have to do is front up defense capability. They don't have to develop some big offensive capability. Defense is easier and cheaper than offense. Europe could easily do that, but they don't want to because they're cheap, because they'll let the Americans do it. And the Americans have been offering to do it because it's easy bucks for American defense corporations and all that sort of stuff. And so I could see how that system is finally breaking down, but it's not going to happen overnight, and Europe's going to have to face some choices that will require it to actually quit exploiting Americans on this.
And it's because Europe is lying to itself as well. Like, it's not just simply about the international global order, but they like to proclaim, that they are standing for a pluralistic society and all sort of stuff. But of course, you have there's a few examples of greater persecution, as you mentioned on the free speech issue and the way it monitors social media posts and things like that. But some of the countries that are most explicitly hostile to political minorities and political opposition are the very European countries bemoaning that, we're losing civility and, America's being a bully and yada, yada, yada. So, they can't even come to frank terms with their own way of, their own lies that they are perpetrating, which again are undermining their own, their own nations.
Well, yeah, I think we can. Go ahead.
I'm just agreeing with what you're saying, but I do really put a lot of emphasis on the American side of that, because I sort of look at it almost like spoiled children. Maybe they have rich parents and they have the luxury of not having to get out and get a job for themselves because they have that kind of backstop. And I feel like that, America's given a lot of these countries the luxury to essentially destroy the institutions that, gave them the wealth and power to sort of help Europe explode to sort of the top of the world. So it's kind of interesting with the whole Carney speech. Maybe potentially some people in Europe are talking about pivoting away from relying on the U.S. that much, but it seems like I don't know if they understand really what that means. If you take away that backstop, you can't keep doing what you're doing. And even if China's coming in investing more, it's kind of absurd to think about what this would look like. But if there was really a division between the U.S. and Europe, and then China was really coming in and getting a lot more involved there, a lot of the influence we've had over Europe is over defense. And that's not really something that China can do in the same way that we could. So if we started to view some of these countries as being in bed with China and they were kind of geopolitical rivals in that way, Europe is powerless on that front. But and you can kind of take China out of the equation there. If the U.S. isn't there, then yeah, they would have to start investing more in their defense, and they would not really be able to continue with these, extreme. Well, they're basically welfare states where we're giving their governments the ability to just hand money out to, interest groups and people within their countries. And when that all goes away, like they're going to be forced to recommit to, actually cultivating the institutions that make society wealthy, which is sort of what, leads to power down the road. And it's like the spoiled kid that won't get a job. Like I don't know if they fully understand that they can't just keep going in this sort of like liberal international direction they're going right now if they don't have the U.S., but they still kind of seem interested in not being reliant on the U.S. I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, just to show the hypocrisy and just how unserious these European leaders are. Again, like Macron was out there calling for more Chinese investment as part of this sort of repivoting the strategy. The same Macron has talked about how, we need stronger sanctions on Russia trading partners from third world countries. So who is Russia's most important ally, economic partner? It's China. We want more of Chinese money, but we need to have tougher sanctions on other countries accepting Russian oil. I mean, this is just, it's absolutely unserious here. And if Russia is the great boogeyman of Europe, then a pivot to China really doesn't make a ton of strategic sense. And so again, like, it just shows just how absolute, shallow, this entire rhetoric I think really is. And outside of, it's more about complaining about Washington than it is some sort of, actual blueprint, some actual serious policy pivot I would expect from European leaders.
Well, so much of what they say is just for consumption of the general public, which is barely paying attention. So they're not even going to see the contradiction there. And they're just going to hear their president saying, oh, he wants more direct investment. That's good. I guess Macron's good. And I've already forgotten about this thing he said about third world sanctions and such, right? They can't remember anything from one week to the next because they got like a regular job and stuff like that. So they know they can just keep pumping out lies and whatever's a good soundbite that is that week. The public has forgotten what he said the week before. And this brings us to the Greenland issue, which I think is a perfect show of, I think, what is basically Trump's method here based on the last news I've seen of a deal. So here's the current deal I know about. Maybe you guys have got even more recent information. The deal that the U.S. is currently proposing is that the U.S. has tiny pockets of sovereign territory inside Greenland on which to put military bases. In other words, basically the status quo. So Nothing has changed in Greenland, but Trump will declare it a great victory. So let's walk through the Greenland rhetoric, right? He's for years been saying the U.S. needs Greenland. U.S. needs Greenland for security purposes. Also, we're going to mine it. We're going to develop it finally. There's too few people there. It's going to be the 51st state. It's going to be part of America. It's finally going to, we're just going to do something with it, which the Danes have done nothing. And then he says he's going to conquer it. And then he says he's going to buy it. And then when all the dust settles, what is he saying? Oh, we're going to have military bases there. That's the deal. That's the current deal. Well, the U.S. has always been free to put military bases there since World War II. It can have thousands of troops there. It has never been constrained in its ability to put Cold War style installations in Greenland designed for missile defense and other purposes. And so the fact that Trump's doing that now, no change from what has been true for decades. But again, he says a lot of things. The people who are sort of barely paying attention, they're thinking, oh, Trump, he's a tough talker. Those Greenland people, they want to help Russia and China conquer the world. If we don't take over Greenland, China and Russia are going to nuke us and win a nuclear war. And if you pay attention to social media, it's everywhere. They were like posting maps of like ICBM paths and stuff over Greenland, which again is all irrelevant because the U.S. already has installations addressing that issue there. And so since they're barely paying attention, Trump talks tough, says all these things America's going to do if it has control of Greenland. And now he's going to go out and say, yes, I won us some sovereignty. We now have a sovereign outpost in Greenland and we're going to put military bases there. America is safe now. Nothing changed. It only seemed like he accomplished something if you have no idea what's going on. And it's going to work great for him because all of his core supporters are going to take their takeaway from this is going to be it's America first. Trump's a tough talker. He's making North America safe. And so Macron doing similar stuff. It works on certain people. But the people who are paying attention, who naysay that stuff, we're going to be told we just have a bad attitude, that being too negative, that we just have Trump derangement syndrome. But I think Greenland is going to be a very interesting model going forward in terms of how does this method work in terms of engaging with the public and having negotiations, quote unquote, with other allies and other countries, which end up moving the needle almost not at all, but provide some interesting sound bites domestically. That seems to be it's all about domestic politics. It doesn't seem to be any like real world geopolitics going on here because nothing's changed. But I think what's affecting people at Davos now is just how Europe and other American allies have basically been the whipping boy in this rhetoric, is that it's just been a nonstop assault on Europe, claims that European allies are useless, that the Danes are somehow bad allies. And so I think all that stuff starts to take its toll. And so while I do think the Greenland thing works well domestically, I do think it's going to feed into this larger narrative we were talking about before in terms of unraveling that narrative of the international order that existed up until now.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of it's what caused all the dynamics we were just talking about with the Carney speech, is sort of in the lead up to this conference, that over the last, I'd say 2 weeks especially, Trump has really escalated the rhetoric about Greenland, and was like hinting that he would send troops and invade it, which everybody was freaking out about. I never bought that. That's never what I was worried about. But what I was kind of pulling my hair out about earlier in the week, I wrote my whole weekly article about it this week, was just what you were saying, Ryan, that everything that was on the table, everything he was trying to do is like, it was the status quo. He was trying to bring about the status quo, but the whole thing was he was trying to buy Greenland. They were talking about spending $700 billion, technically a little more than that, because then they were going to give like $100,000 per resident of Greenland. So like $706 billion. But if you look at what we were actually getting, it was nothing. Well, like you said, I think since 1951, there's been a treaty where the U.S. can have military assets on Greenland, and we have not even like gotten even close to the limit of what we're allowed to do militarily on Greenland in that time. We've always been able to ramp those things up. I do think, obviously I'm an opponent of the whole imperial project, but I think there's a better argument to be made about having defensive military assets on Greenland than like Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. Like, yeah, like that isn't like, people often think of Russia as being like, we think of wall maps, right? So it's like way over here when the U.S. is over here. But like Russia and the U.S. are actually pretty close. And in the event of a nuclear war, it would like the missiles would be going over the poles. So if you're going to have an early defense or an early detection radar station, Greenland, the north of Greenland, is an excellent place for the U.S. to have that. So like that all makes sense. But we have that already. And on top of that, it was basically having military assets there, keeping the Russians and Chinese out of Greenland, and mining as well. I looked into the mining stuff too, and it's just Greenland is not an exceptionally great mining prospect. Most of it is essentially under permanent ice sheets year round, and a lot of the partisans were kind of really trying to make it seem more appealing by looping in like copper and things. So not much there. And also at the same time, like it's kind of the classic, if the government has to tell businesses to go make money at something, it's probably not actually a very profitable opportunity. But yeah, and then once again, we already have a pretty big military presence there, and it's technically ruled by the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a NATO ally. So like the idea that the Russians were just going to come take it under the status quo, basically it was all like it was just driving me crazy because people were talking about Greenland like, yeah, it's strategically a good place for us to have military assets. We already do. It's like it could be a good place to mine. Yeah, well, like that's not really, but there's already kind of negotiations happening about. To be fair, specifically on that front, I guess there were some people saying that the EU's overly stringent mining regulations were not great, and it would be better if those were not constraining the mining companies. But there were already, my understanding is, negotiations happening where the EU is like, yeah, maybe we can relax some of that stuff. So like, yeah, not exactly something that would require us to conquer Greenland, and then the same thing, like we already have a heavy presence there. And so for all of that, for Trump changing nothing, he wanted to force us to spend $700 billion. That was just like the craziest thing, in my opinion. And so I was, like I was kind of pulling my hair out, arguing with some people about this earlier in the week. And then Trump gets to Davos and just completely flips. And like you said, they're now making this deal. He's bragging about paying nothing, but he's also getting nothing because it's the same thing. And he's going to rebrand it as a win.
Well, you got the framework of a future deal, Connor.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of, but I think that's kind of ultimately, I mean, I think that's kind of the motivation is, we've talked about it a lot, and I think we're going to continue to talk about it a lot for the next, 3 years, is that Trump's domestic agenda, like Congress prevents anything meaningful happening domestically, changes in the margin. And so Trump wants big, bold things that he can take credit for. And so this, even if the framework at the end of the day is a very, is a marginal change to the status quo, he can take credit for it. And I think, and I think that's going to be the main story that we're going to continue to see. And of course, he used tariffs, which is his favorite tool, right, as a negotiation tactic and all that sort of stuff. But he wants to stack up accomplishments that he can sell, and foreign policy is the easiest way for him to do it. So I think you're going to see a lot more stuff like this. There was a report that I would not want to be in the Cuban government, right, during the rest of 2026, right? And I think that to Ryan's point, I don't even think it plays that well domestically. Is the larger problem here as well? Is that obviously, I think if you're looking for accomplishments to celebrate with Trump, then again, this is something that is a marginal change to that relationship. But I think that what you're seeing is an erosion. All the polling shows a massive erosion of the coalition that Trump had in 2024 because they wanted more domestic concern. Like the major issues were inflation and the economy, some culture war stuff, right? He was elected off of a domestic agenda. They didn't want to need to know. They didn't want to have Venezuela in the headlines. They didn't want to have Cuba in the headlines. They didn't particularly care about Greenland in the headlines, right? Greenland was kind of just more of a meme than anything else. And so I think this is the larger issue that Trump has, is that the more that he wants to have these accomplishments, the more he is eroding the very coalition that gave him power in 2024. And I have a feeling that that's going to play out in a big way come 2026, and we'll see what 2028 looks like. And so to me, I think the domestic policy side of this is perhaps even more interesting than the international relations standpoint, because all the people in Europe that don't like Trump now, with one exception. I think one of the interesting components to this, and you even saw this a little bit with Venezuela, is that you're starting to see a massive fracture within the global right, particularly between Europe and the United States. The first international leader, or one of the first international leaders to criticize the Maduro raid, was Marine Le Pen, who said, well, I care about national sovereignty. This was infringement about sovereignty. I don't like Venezuela's government, but Venezuela has sovereignty. You're seeing right-wing members of the European Parliament saying that this, criticizing Trump on this. And so I think that's the one extent where, the only people internationally that have changed their minds of this issue is that you're starting to see a breakaway from very Trump-inspired, historically friendly European parties starting to get concerned with some of this action. It'll be interesting to see, is this a blip in the pan, right, or how that goes going forward. How much that really influences, obviously, American politics is left to be seen. But I do think it's very perhaps encouraging, right? If we want more nations to be independent, if we want more political nationalism at the expense of the EU, right? The idea that nationalism is better than globalism. If this further sharpens concerns about national sovereignty, even related to a Republican-controlled United States, maybe that is, going back to our first topic, one of these areas where the right is even more skeptical of a Republican-controlled Washington. And so it's not just a left-right divide in terms of how you view Washington going forward.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Power and Market Podcast. Thank you, Tho. Thank you, Connor. If you haven't been, be sure and subscribe to our weekly or daily emails. If you want to keep up on new content over at the Mises Institute, just go to mises.org and click on the top right where it says subscribe. But
And Ryan, you can like and subscribe on the podcast as well. Boost our numbers on the podcast algorithms too. So I want to get that in there.
Yes, you should do that. And we will, of course, we'll give you another opportunity to do that again next week. So we will be back next time with another episode here of Power Market, and we'll see you then.